All right, we are live. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Emerson Green. Today I'll be moderating a debate between Dr. Ralph Stefan Weir and Ben Watkins of Relay Theology on the interaction problem for substance dualism. The loser shall be executed by David Chalmers. We'll have 15-minute opening statements followed by brief rebuttals and then open discussion before we take your questions. Get your super chats in if you want your question to definitely be answered. But why don't you guys take a minute to introduce yourselves and the position you'll be defending? And let's start with Ben.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Emerson. So for those who don't know me, my name is Ben Watkins. I am one of the co-hosts of Real Theology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from atheist perspectives. I've also done a good bit of work in the philosophy of mind. I've recently contributed to a chapter on what's called the argument from physical minds. So the idea that because our minds are physically dependent, that is at least some evidence for atheism and against theism. So naturally, the position that I'll be taking up today is the position or materialist position. So I'll use physicalism and materialism interchangeably today. I won't draw any kind of subtle distinction between those terms. And obviously, defending the idea that the interaction problem does pose a serious problem to substance dualism in the sense that it gives us at least some reason to prefer materialism to substance dualism.
All right, excellent. Ralph, do you want to tell us who you are and what you've been working on?
Hi, I'm Ralph Weir. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Lincoln, and I've written a bunch of stuff about the mind-body problem, including a book called The Mind-Body Problem and Metaphysics. I'm arguing on the other side to Ben, although I really admire what Ben does with the real theology pod and so on. And I'm not personally wedded to the idea that interactionist dualism is the best way of understanding the mind-body relation. But I do think it's being given an unreasonably hard time, I think, due to intellectual fashion, and I see the interaction problem as instantiated in the causal closure argument, which I think we're going to be discussing today, as an example of this, where an argument is treated as being much stronger than, in my judgment, it really is.
And that book is really, really good. The Mind-Body Problem in Metaphysics. I have it right here, but I can't grab it because it's underneath a stack of 4 other books, and catastrophe will follow if I try to show it.
What's it doing there?
It's underneath my books about Bigfoot. But anyway, so I guess we're going to start with Ben. And and by the way, check out my interview, very long interview with Dr. Ralph Stefan Weir. He was very generous with his time. We talked about substance dualism and a lot of other things. And I interviewed Ben a long time ago. I kind of forgot about this, but it was when I first got like moral realism pilled, and we talked about the moral argument for God like a long time ago. But all right, Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thanks. For your American viewers, you will know that it's July 5th. We just had July 4th. So I do like to think of this debate as something as the Revolutionary War Part 2. First off, let me go ahead and start by saying that we learn most from those that we disagree with. And that's certainly been true of Ralph Weir. Though we differ deeply on the philosophy of mind, I've found unexpected common ground, revised my own views in light of his work, and learned a great deal from him just in conversations that we've had kind of informally on Twitter. And also, before I forget, I'm grateful to Emerson for this opportunity to continue the conversations that Ralph and I have had elsewhere, but also just to come on his show again. I consider all 3 of you friends, and so this is just a really great opportunity that I've really been looking forward to, and so I'm glad we were able to band together and pull together and do this. So let me get started here with the interaction problem itself, at least how I see it, or at least where I'm thinking about it today, because my thought has certainly evolved about this over the years. So the interaction problem traditionally asks how a non-physical mind could cause a physical body to move. The challenge isn't whether this happens, we experience that, but how to make sense of it. If mind and body are fundamentally different, what is it that connects them? The problem is metaphysical, as I see it. Not about whether mental causation is real, but how it could be. Um, so the mind body problem generally challenges both dualism and materialism. And if there's a hard problem of consciousness, that is explaining why and how subjective experience arises, then I also think there's an interaction problem, how mental states cause physical effects. Yet simply adopting either of these views doesn't resolve the mind body problem. Whether we say minds are physical or non-physical, we still face the task of explaining how consciousness specifically fits into the causal structure of the world, whether it's how minds are physical things or what relation they stand so that they may interact with physical things. And so to approach the mind-body problem responsibly, let me begin at the outset with a set of reasonable auxiliary assumptions. First, let's assume the existence of a material world. So our bodies have spatial location, non-mental properties that exist independently of our perception of them. Second, for the sake of discussion here, I know this can be controversial in other circles, but let's reject idealism. Let's go ahead and say that your body occupies one place, mine another, and this space and those bodies are real. Third, let's affirm that causation runs both between minds and bodies and between mental states themselves. So this is to, on the outset, rule out epiphenomenalism and what's called parallelism, which deny causal powers to the mental. Fourth, let's reject eliminativism. Beliefs, desires, and sensations are not illusions or convenient fictions. They are real features of our mental lives. And then finally, let's assume the principle of causal exclusion. So no single event has more than one sufficient cause at a given time, unless it is a general case of causal overdetermination. And we can get into that more detail if conversation permits. And so together, these assumptions form a common sense foundation from which to evaluate materialism and dualism, helping us avoid metaphysical evasions while keeping our disagreements sharply in view. So these are my assumptions, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. Um, the mind body problem centers on an apparent contradiction. Minds and bodies interact, yet minds are said to be non-physical while bodies are physical. And how could two such fundamentally different kinds of things causally influence one another? The interaction problem is a genuine problem because it is part of the mind-body problem, and that is surely a genuine problem. I would go as far as to say it's one of the most sublime problems that we can think about in philosophy. Um, and if physical and non-physical substances cannot interact, then either mental causation is impossible or our understanding of the mind or body must be mistaken somehow. So substance dualism holds that minds and bodies are distinct substances, one mental and irreducible, the other physical and reducible. This view honors the intuition that mentality cannot be captured by physical description alone. However, it faces the interaction problem head on. How can those non-physical mental properties move physical properties like those found in our bodies? So materialism or physicalism avoids this problem by holding that both minds and bodies are physical. Mental events just are physical events realized in the brain. This view preserves interaction and causal efficacy, but must then confront the hard problem of consciousness, why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience. Ultimately, any adequate solution to the mind body problem must preserve both mental causation and the reality of conscious experience. The challenge is to intelligibly reconcile what seems like irreconcilable truths. So the question is often posed this way: how can thoughts, desires, and conscious experiences cause bodily movements like winces and groans? But this framing can be somewhat misleading. The real question is not whether such causation occurs, we observe it constantly, but rather what kind of relation must mental and physical states stand in for this causal influence to be possible. The challenge is to uncover the metaphysical structure that makes sense of the interaction we have taken for granted. The heart of the interaction problem lies not merely in the radical difference between minds and bodies, but in the kind of difference that seems to rule out any causal connection between them. How could an immaterial thought or desire initiate movement in a material body? How could something that lacks mass, shape, and location transfer energy to a brain state or contribute to the functioning of a unified person? So Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia famously pressed Descartes on precisely this point. In her words, I beg you to tell me how the human soul can determine the movement of muscles in the body so as to perform voluntary acts, being as it is immaterial. For the determination of the movement seems always to come about from the moving bodies being propelled, to depend on the kind of impulse it gets from what it sets in motion, or again, on the nature and shape of this latter thing's surface. Now, the first two conditions involve contact, but contact seems to me incompatible with a thing's being immaterial. And more pointedly, she says, I admit it would be easier for me to concede matter an extension to the soul than the capacity of moving a material thing and being moved to an immaterial being. So some object that the interaction problem is not real, that it begs the question, or that it arises from nowhere. But these dismissals, I think, miss the point. The problem emerges from the claim that mind is distinct from body in such a way that causal interaction with material things is precluded. Others argue that physicalism faces a similar challenge, since if consciousness is irreducible, then explaining mental causation remains a problem. Causation is strange, after all, so physicalism has just as much trouble accounting for mental causation as dualism. Let me take a moment and reply to these common objections. First, the interaction problem and the explanatory gap are two sides of the same coin. If the gap is a problem for physicalism, then the interaction problem is a problem for dualism. So the problem doesn't come from nowhere, it comes part and parcel with the mind-body problem. Like the problem of evil for theism, the interaction problem does not beg the question. It arises from the difficulty of reconciling a theory's claims with observable reality. Just as the problem of evil challenges the coherence of theism by confronting it with suffering, the interaction problem challenges interactionist dualism by confronting it with metaphysical claims that seem to preclude causal interaction. Physicalism, however, denies the existence of non-physical minds and thus avoids the interaction problem entirely, just as atheism avoids the problem of evil by denying the existence of God. To say the interaction problem applies equally to physicalism is no more accurate than claiming the problem of evil applies equally to atheism. The logic of the two problems is exactly the same. So let me now try to articulate the interaction problem in a forceful and clear way. What I'll call the falsifiability challenge will press interactionism to clarify whether it makes testable claims, either deductively or inductively. Does it function like an empirical theory, such as neurophysiological hypotheses? Or is it more akin to an invisible dragon in our garage or a ghost in a machine, unfalsifiable and immune to observation? For deductive testability, a theory must, with the help of honest auxiliary assumptions, entail an observation that would not follow from the auxiliaries alone. Probabilistically, it must confer a likelihood on an observation. The probability of the evidence given the theory and auxiliaries must differ from the probability given the auxiliaries alone. Without meeting one of these conditions, interactionism risks drifting into metaphysical obscurity with no empirical relevance, much like an invisible dragon in our garage or a ghost in the machine. Next, what I'll call the translatability challenge holds that a new theory cannot actually replace an old one if the old theory is not disconfirmed and accounts for all the new theory's observations, especially when the new theory fails to explain everything the old one does. This raises a key question for interactionism. Can it supplant physicalism without such a cognitive loss? If something like physical causal closure cannot be denied without cognitive loss, and mental causation, causal exclusion, and the reality of a physical world are granted, then interactionism cannot replace materialism, as there would be a sound argument to materialism from the interaction problem. Also notice that if interactionism cannot meet the falsifiability challenge, then it cannot meet the translatability challenge in principle. If interactionism has no empirical content, then replacing physicalism with it will obviously involve cognitive loss. This is where the pairing problem becomes relevant. Without a clear relation that can pair immaterial minds to the material effects of bodies, interactionism lacks empirical content, thus failing the falsifiability challenge. Since causes typically connect to effects through spatially contiguous chains, immaterial minds lacking spatial location offer no framework from which to pair physical effects with mental causes. When I intend to raise my hand, why does the hand of this body raise rather than that one? Why not both? An inability to answer these questions casts serious doubt on interactionism's ability to account for mental causation and replace physical causal closure without cognitive loss, thus failing the translatability challenge. Let's call this the in-principle interaction problem. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that interactionism can meet the falsifiability challenge in principle. Can it meet the translatability challenge in practice? I don't think it can. Let's call this the de facto interaction problem. Consider the principle of physical causal closure. If a physical event has a cause at a given time, it has a sufficient physical cause at that time. This is not an arbitrary assumption, but an inductive generalization supported by neuroscience and effective quantum field theory, which accurately predicts all known particle interactions and forces relevant to brain function in everyday life. So behavior and cognition can already be fully explained in physical terms. Causal closure has not been disconfirmed, and causal closure makes all of the empirical predictions of interactionism. So the denial of causal closure involves cognitive loss, thus failing the translatability challenge in practice. Now, imagine we discovered that some neuronal event, such as the firing of a particular neuron, cannot be physically explained by preceding physical conditions alone, even probabilistically under effective quantum field theory. Instead, a non-physical cause, like a conscious mind or soul, appears to act on the brain with observable physical consequences. Such a finding would be revolutionary. These non-physical causes would violate conservation laws of energy and momentum unless somehow smuggled in, causing deviations from effective quantum field theory's predictions, manifesting as unexplained energy shifts, altered particle trajectories, or anomalous field behavior. Yet, to date, no reliable or repeatable evidence of such violations has emerged in neuroscience. All measured brain activity aligns with causal closure, and no experiment has detected particles or fields behaving in ways that defy effective quantum field theory's predictions. The prospects of disconfirming causal closure are dim. Furthermore, it is an uncontroversial empirical discovery that for every mental state, there's a corresponding physical state that at least appears nomologically necessary. Let's call this the correlation thesis. The mental is realized by neurobiology and neurobiology is realized by physics, then the mental is physically realized because the realization relation is transitive. The correlation theorist is well confirmed and far more likely given causal closure than its denial. Since interactionism implies the negation of causal closure, and the negation of causal closure is less probable intrinsically than causal closure, interactionism is likely false given the correlation thesis, other things being equal. So the prospects of interactionism meeting the translatability challenge are also dim. In closing, it might be objected that this de facto objection relies too heavily on causal closure, or that substance dualism can be maintained even if we locate non-physical mental states in space. Additionally, there are the conclusions of traditional conceivability arguments that push us away from reducing mind to matter. Let's concede all of this for the sake of argument. I argue that interactionism cannot meet the translatability challenge without ever appealing to causal closure. Suppose my thirst has a neural substrate, N1, and my desire to drink has a neural substrate, N2, and neural events are physical. Suppose further that neuroscience discovers a causal chain from N1 to N2, such that my thirst causes my desire to drink water by way of N1 sufficiently causing N2. Since N2 already has a sufficient physical cause, and we reject causal overdetermination in this case, it follows that no non-physical cause was needed or involved in producing this bodily movement. Unless the causal chain discovered by neuroscience from N1 to N2 can be translated into interactionist terms, interactionism will fail to meet the translatability challenge. So where does all of this leave us? I think it leaves us with a sound causal argument for materialism from the interaction problem. Bodies are physical things, minds and bodies causally interact, and physical and non-physical things cannot interact, hence minds are physical things. As we've just seen, the interaction problem is motivated by interactionism's inability to meet the falsifiability and translatability challenges. It cannot meet the falsifiability challenge in principle because of the pairing problem, cannot meet the translatability challenge, both because of the in-principality falsifiability challenge and interaction's inability to replace causal closure without cognitive loss in practice, and it cannot avoid epiphenomenalism given highly plausible empirical assumptions about the neurophysiology of mental states like thirst, along with commonsensical assumptions about causality. Given all of this is more or less right, the prospects of interactionism replacing materialism in the philosophy of the mind, I argue, are dim indeed. And I'll turn the floor over to Ralph.
All right, thank you very much for that. Just for the audience, could you give in a nutshell description of what you mean by the translatability challenge, just in a sentence or two?
Yes. So if one theory is to replace another theory, you have to translate all of the empirical successes of the original theory into terms of the new theory. If you can't do that, then there's a cognitive loss. You lose something like explanatory power, explanatory scope. One of the explanatory virtues is lost. And so that's not what we're looking for in a theory. When we move from one theory to another, we want it to increase theoretical virtue. We don't want it to have what's called cognitive loss.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ralph Stefan Weir.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was a really masterful overview, I thought, of the interaction problem, I guess, in several versions thereof. What I want to do is, in the hope that this will help us get somewhere, focus on what I take to be the most influential version of the problem, which is the causal closure problem, and maybe once I've convinced you that that's not a serious problem, we can move on to the pairing problem and Elizabeth Bohemia's impact problem and so on, and see if they still pose an important issue without the causal closure objection. Now, I want to go through like a few things. I guess I've got like 9 points here that I want to get onto the table. Hopefully that I can do them fairly quickly in succession. Just first to say how I understand dualism. I think dualism, in the sense that contrasts with physicalism, which is the predominant view among philosophers and scientists at the moment, is just the view that there's a non-physical mental component of human beings in addition to our physical bodies. By non-physical, we just mean that it's neither identical or in any other way nothing over and above the fundamentally non-mental things described by physics. So fermions, bosons, the 4 fundamental physical forces and complex systems of these, including brain processes, insofar as these are indeed fundamentally non-mental, contrary to the view of panpsychists like Galen Strawson or Philip Goff. So according to dualism, there's no deeper level at which our thoughts and experiences are really just brain processes, although they are obviously very intimately related to brain processes. Indeed, I'd say they obviously arise out of or causally depend on brain processes, at least most of the time, meaning dualism poses no threat to the profound importance of neuroscience for understanding the mind. And Ben mentioned substance dualism. I think it's true that like a very ancient and perhaps a kind of a cognitive default view of human nature sees the non-physical mind as this unitary entity, like a soul that can float free of the body. But contemporary dualists will often posit merely non-physical mental properties or events. And in my opinion, if the interaction problem poses a threat to substance dualism, soul-body dualism, it poses a threat to any kind of dualism. So I see myself here as kind of defending the broad family of dualist views. Now, as I said, there are many interaction problems, or the idea that a non-physical mind, whether we conceive of it as a separable substance or as a load of non-physical properties or whatever, the idea that it could not act causally on a physical body, of course, arises really early after Descartes' version of dualism, certainly not the first version of dualism or even substance dualism, in the work of Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, Pierre Gassendi, and others. And you see really, I think, quite independent versions of this objection arising again and again over the history of philosophy. But I think it's broadly correct to say that only one version of this problem is really influential in contemporary theories about the mind-body relation, and that is the causal closure argument, which played a fairly central role in Ben's presentation of the interaction problem. I see the causal closure argument as going roughly like this. It says, well, our minds cause bodily movements. These bodily movements are physical effects. They're physical, right? They belong to the kind of fundamentally non-mental stuff described by physics. Every physical effect is brought about by a chain of sufficient physical causes. These bodily movements can't be caused twice over by an independent chain of physical causes and a non-physical mind. That would be too bizarre a coincidence. And therefore, the mental causes of physical events must themselves somehow be physical. They must be ultimately brain processes, even if that looks surprising at face value. Now, I think I'd agree with many of Ben's assumptions about this, or at least I'd be very willing to accept for the sake of argument, there really is a physical world. Idealism, let's suppose, is false. So if there are non-physical minds, these are extra entities over and above the physical entities. And I'm inclined to grant the falsehood of epiphenomenalism or causal overdetermination. So, and I think that leaves only one way in which the dualist can respond to this argument. So there are the three ways that have been tried out are, first of all, you could simply deny that the non-physical mind has physical effects, causes bodily movements, and the great biologist Thomas Huxley, Darwin's kind of protege, put forward that idea, suggesting that conscious experience is kind of like the steam arising out of a locomotive engine. It is caused by what's going on in the engine. It's something over and above it, but it doesn't act on it. The second view you could take is that, well, maybe the bodily actions really are caused twice over by independent mental and physical chains of causation. That looks like a big coincidence, but the great philosopher, metaphysician E.J. Lowe has suggested, well, maybe a coincidence at the level of the laws of nature, psychophysical laws in this case, isn't a problem. Why should we worry about that? Does it even make sense to talk about a coincidence at that level? And then the third way to respond would be to challenge the idea that we have good reason to believe that the physical effects of mental causes are brought about by chains of sufficient causation, or have reason to believe the causal closure principle that physical effects generally are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes. Now, I guess I don't actually think that epiphenomenalism and double causation have been decisively refuted, but personally, I'm not just willing to set them aside. I don't find them attractive. So I think in the case of double causation, I actually think, Ben referred to standards of theory choice. It seems to me that the kind of view Lowe explores requires us to posit a bunch of extra psychophysical laws that don't add any explanatory strength to our causal theory. We could have a simpler causal theory if we suppose that all the causes are physical and mental occurrences, non-physical mental occurrences are mere effects. Therefore, there's a lot of pressure, I think, to be an epiphenomenalist if you accept the causal closure principle and you want to be a dualist of any sort. And then epiphenomenalism, well, I again agree with Ben, I think we just experience all the time that our mental states act on our physical bodies. Furthermore, I find William James's evolutionary argument against epiphenomenalism quite plausible. Consciousness seems to play this important, adaptively important role in our functioning as sentient beings, and epiphenomenalism can't account for that. So I want to say, yeah, I think a dualist ought to challenge the causal closure principle itself. Now, the causal closure principle, one thing I want to emphasize about this is that this is the principle that says all physical effects are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes. Now, this is an empirical claim, not an a priori one, and therefore it needs to be supported by empirical evidence. And I think there are two kinds of evidence you could give in favor of it. You could give indirect inductive support based on observations essentially of inanimate matter, not of observations of the brains of humans or other sentient creatures. Or you could try to give direct biological support from observation of the human nervous system. And for reasons I'm going to explain, I think inductive support, which is usually based on physics, isn't going to be helpful here. And that's because inductive arguments are very easily defeated by further information. Therefore, what's needed is direct evidence from biology. And I'm going to suggest that we should be very confident first that the biological evidence was not there at the time physicalism became the dominant view in contemporary thought, suggesting that whatever else may be true, the tendency of philosophers and scientists interested in this stuff to be physicalist over the last 70 years or so is not based on good scientific evidence, at least not good scientific evidence of the sort appealed to by the causal closure argument. And secondly, I will suggest today, we also have nothing like the kind of biological evidence we would need for this to be a good argument. So the case from the indirect inductive case, as I say, is usually based on physics. A lot of people make this case. Daniel Dennett, David Lewis has a version of it. Sean Carroll is a influential and very engaging physicist who's put forward this argument. I've got a quotation from a Scientific American article by him here where he says, "The laws of physics underlying everyday life are completely understood. There can't be a new collection of spirit forces that interact with our regular atoms because we would have detected them in existing experiments." Now, the question I want to ask when I read Carroll saying that is, what experiments? And interestingly, he doesn't really tell us. And this reflects a very widespread phenomenon in defenses of the causal closure argument. People often say, well, we have excellent scientific evidence for this, but they don't cite evidence, they don't cite specific observations or experiments. And I want to say that this wouldn't pass muster if they were arguing for a claim that didn't happen to be just so fashionable and scientific sounding as the causal closure principle. But I think we can agree the answer, insofar as there is one, is that the observations would have had to be made in the behavior of inanimate matter under highly constrained conditions, such as those at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, because it's those kinds of observations on which our really detailed physics is based. However, it seems fairly clear that that evidence is largely, and I'll come back to this, largely irrelevant to the question of mind-body interaction because, well, obviously interactionist dualism does not predict that we should observe any novel forces operating in inanimate matter outside of the brains of living sentient organisms. I think this is a version of what's known as the street light fallacy. There's the old joke that a drunk is looking around, scrabbling about under a street light. In the first version I first heard, this guy was Wittgenstein, but I think that's just because I was in Cambridge at the time. A policeman comes over and says, what's going on here, sir? And he says, well, I'm looking for my keys. And the policeman starts helping him search. Finally, he says, are you sure you lost them here? And the drunk says, no, I lost them over there, but it's too dark to search over there. So I think appealing to physics or appealing to any observations of inanimate matter to judge whether interactionist dualism is empirically plausible commits a version of the same fallacy that the drunk in that joke is committing. And I won't say anything further on physics, but I think there's some really great work by Brian Pitts, a former colleague of mine, showing how interactionist dualism seems plausible even when you look at it in the context of detailed physics. He provides even a toy mathematical model of how one might think about this. Now, I don't think we need to worry that much about the case from physics, because the most serious physicalists grant that that's not going to give us the support for the causal closure argument that we need. Rather, it needs to come from biology, and this is due to the really excellent work of the great physicalist David Papineau. So Papineau has two or three really influential arguments, or articles rather, I think one chapter in a monograph by him, one article, one chapter in a collected volume, where he presents the causal closure argument. And he very admirably admits that when he first thought about this, he took it for granted that physics tells us causal closure is true. However, he spends most of this chapter and the other versions of it that exist explaining why this does not seem to be the case, even if physicists never observe forces beyond the four fundamental physical forces operating in inanimate matter. Dualism doesn't predict they would, so this seems evidentially neutral. What we need is evidence from biology. And Papineau suggests that the reason why physicalism became the predominant position in the 1950s and 60s is that this was when the biological evidence for causal closure became clear-cut. Now, Papineau, like Carroll, does not cite any publication, any specific experiment or observation in support of his claim. The entire biological case in the most influential presentation of the causal closure argument, so far as I can tell, is confined to one sentence where, after giving a bit of background context to do with wider biology, Papineau says that in the same period, the 50s and 60s, neurophysiological research mapped the body's neuronal network and analyzed the electrical mechanisms responsible for neuronal activity. And he says that this provided clear-cut evidence of causal closure in biological systems, thereby accounting for the rise of physicalism. Now, I am not persuaded that what Papineau says there is reasonable. So it's slightly difficult to judge because he doesn't say which experiments or observations he has in mind specifically, but in the 1960s, the most precise procedure for imaging a living brain was electroencephalography. And this has a spatial resolution of several centimeters. It's got, the average electrical activity of like 100,000 neurons. It's not even really 3D. It can't look at the deep activity within the brain. It's just not the kind of thing that's going to allow you to judge whether non-physical forces might be operating. Greater precision could be achieved by invasive methods like implanted electrodes, but you can't measure large portions of the brain like that. And these tend to cause neuronal death, so there are real difficulties using that approach. Something else I think Papineau might have had in mind is Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley's Nobel Prize-winning work using the giant axon of a squid to measure the electrical charges during a nerve impulse. They provide a precise mathematical model. This was a really important kind of leap forward in our understanding of how neurons work. But this is work on an isolated neuron from a squid, right? Not a neuron in a living brain. The paper in which they present their research makes it very clear that dualism or no dualism, we would expect to see other things going on if the neuron were present in a living body. So I don't think that's more relevant to causal closure really than the physics stuff that Papineau dismisses. And then as for his claim about mapping the body's neuronal network, well, to me that sounds like arguably a real exaggeration. So today that sounds like the field that's become known as connectomics. given its name in the early 2000s, but it's been going on since maybe the 70s, which is that of trying to map the wiring diagram of all the neurons in a given animal's brain, or ideally in its whole nervous system. But in the period Papineau is referring to, that has, I mean, it's barely even an aspiration, and it's only first achieved for the microscopic worm C. elegans in, I think, 1986 or something like that, which only has 302 neurons. It's very different to our 100 billion neurons. Even today, as of last year, we've got a full connectome of a fruit fly, Drosophila, but we're a long, long way off of doing anything like this for a human. And you know, nematodes and fruit flies are regarded as insentient by a lot of specialists in the science of consciousness. So that data might not be that relevant anyway. Fruit flies are more controversial. So I want to say, in the 1960s and 1950s, the period to which Papineau is referring, insofar as this is meant to depend on direct biological evidence of causal closure in sentient organisms, the evidence very clearly is not there. What about today? Well, obviously that's harder to judge because neuroscience has advanced very, very rapidly in all sorts of ways since then. But I spend a fair amount of time reading neuroscientific research, especially stuff that aims at understanding the functioning of the nervous system at the level of the detailed neural wiring. I find this really fascinating. I think it really does illuminate our understanding of how the brain facilitates computation, how it underlies the structure of thought in many ways, and so on. But I'm not aware of anything that seems to me like it would come anywhere close to giving us the kind of direct biological evidence we need for the causal closure principle. Maybe the closest thing I can think of is the Microns project. There was an article in the New York Times about this recently, although the data was actually gathered a few years ago. They managed to record the firing of 75,000 neurons within a 200,000 neuron 1 millimeter squared portion of a mouse brain, basically peering at these through a little window in the mouse's skull. This is really amazing because this was combined with a connectome map for the region, allowing us to see the structure and the dynamics. But as impressive as this is, and you know, way beyond anything they had in the 50s and 60s, the methods used, I think it was 2-photon calcium imaging for the actual dynamics, and then just slicing up and electron microscopy for the neuronal map. These methods do not give anything like the detail you'd need to see whether non-physical forces are operating, right? They can't even distinguish between individual neuron spikes in bursts of firing. They sometimes attribute the firing to the wrong neuron, and so on. So I think it's really obvious that when physicalism came to prominence, this was not because we had not good direct scientific evidence of causal closure. And I also think we don't have it now. Now, I want to say just two more things, I think, if that's okay. Jump in, Emerson, if you think I'm overusing my slot.
Oh, no, keep going.
That's okay? All right. So first of all, I want to grant everyone can agree that there is an inductive case for the causal closure principle, all things being equal. So what I mean by this is, if you confine your attention just to the scientific evidence, whereby that we exclude any introspection of conscious experience or anything like that, just the third personal physical observations, well, we've not observed any physical effects in the nervous system or elsewhere that clearly do need to be explained by any forces beyond the 4 fundamental forces of current physics. Okay, actually there are some qualifications to be made there, maybe we have, but it's certainly not clear we have. And if not, well, Occam's razor suggests that the forces we observe in animate matter, or the events we observe in animate matter, are caused by those same fundamental forces. We can't see how because we don't have the detailed measurement devices at the moment. Perhaps we never will, but this is the simpler hypothesis. However, I want to emphasize that this inductive case is perfectly fine if you set aside anything but that third person observational evidence, but it's nonetheless far from conclusive. And one could illustrate this with a kind of a comparison, an analogy. Suppose every can of Coca-Cola you've ever seen has been red. Well, that would give you a really good inductive case for thinking that, all things being equal, Coca-Cola always comes in a red can. But that inductive line of reasoning could easily be defeated by further information. So if, for example, you heard that as a special promotion of their collaboration with the World Wildlife Federation, Coca-Cola were doing white cans this year with polar bears on them, it would be absurd to reason, no, that can't possibly be the case because all the Coca-Cola cans I've seen before are red. Now, admittedly, in 2011, when Coca-Cola actually did that, they had to stop the promotion halfway through because so many people just wouldn't believe that Coca-Cola could come in a white can. But we should all agree that those people were mistaken. Well, in the same way, the inductive case for causal closure could easily be defeated by further information. If there is further information pointing to dualism, we need not trouble ourselves about the causal closure argument. And I would say, obviously, there is further information pointing to dualism, i.e., and this relates to what Ben said about falsifiability. I think physicalism predicts the non-existence of conscious experience. Dualism predicts the existence of conscious experience. And if there's one empirical datum we definitely have, it is the existence of conscious experience. Now, one can challenge the idea that physicalism predicts the non-existence of conscious experience, but many physicalists grant that that kind of seems to be true. But even if one challenges that, one is no longer appealing to the interaction problem. Now you're focusing on the philosophical arguments for or against dualism. And I want to say it's on those that everything hangs, not on the interaction problem. We should all be able to agree if the evidence is only inductive, then if there were a good argument for dualism, a proponent of that argument need not worry about the putative causal closure of the physical. And I say that of causal closure, I'd say exactly the same about the conservation of energy, which again is an empirical principle. We can't confirm it in any detail in the nervous systems of animate organisms. There's only an inductive case for thinking it applies there. So I want to say, actually the causal closure principle, it's an empirical claim. It needs to be backed up by direct empirical evidence. In the case of if it's going to be used to argue against dualism, we don't have such evidence. And very, very intelligent, brilliant thinkers have been convinced that the principle is nonetheless known to be true. But I want to say we shouldn't be surprised that this happens. I guess no one now would think we had good evidence for causal closure in 1814, but Pierre-Simon Laplace was there asserting its truth. Would anyone say we had good evidence for it back in 1714, when, it's a long time before even the discovery of electromagnetism, which is also after Laplace, but then Leibniz was asserting that we know the principle to be true. We have pretty good evidence that Democritus was asserting it in the 5th century BC. So I think this looks like a principle sometimes people talk themselves into thinking we know when the evidence isn't there. And even David Papineau, again, admirably admits that that was true of him when he first became a supporter of this argument. And he spent a long time showing in detail why the physics does not support the principle before then making the same mistake regarding the biological evidence, in my opinion. So to conclude, what does a proponent of the causal closure argument need to do? Well, I say they've got two options. On the one hand, they could try to show how the inductive case would not be easily defeated by further information of the kind that dualists think they have, because we have conscious experience, conscious thought that is not easy to reduce to anything physical. I think that's really hard to do. And I think attempts to do that are likely to reveal that really it all turns on the arguments about consciousness or whatever, not on the causal closure argument. Or they could try to show that, in fact, we do have the direct biological evidence of causal closure in the nervous system that's needed to support the principle. And when I first read about this, I thought, well, maybe we have that evidence. I don't know. Maybe we can just map someone's nervous system in so much detail, we can predict everything that's going to happen next in accordance with fundamental physical laws and observe, yeah, our predictions are always correct. So clearly there are no non-physical forces intervening. Well, so far as I can tell, we can't do anything like that. And I guess my question for Ben, or for a proponent of this option, would be, neurons communicate with one another by the secretion of neurotransmitters at the synaptic cleft. They're modulated by the stimulation of hundreds of thousands of ion channels on the exterior of a neuron, on its membrane. The signals travel within neurites electrically. There's like hundreds of thousands of miles of these gossamer wires in the brain. They would stretch probably all the way to the moon if you laid them all out. And now, if a non-physical force of some kind were exerting a little excitatory or inhibitory force on the vesicles within a neuron synapse, or increasing or decreasing the stimulation of the ion channels, or dulling or increasing the electrical signals in the neurites, whatever it might be, how would neuroscience observe this? What specific observations would we make that would lead us to expect that if interactionist dualism were true, we would have detected it? What experiments are we talking about? What observations? What methods? And if we can't give the specific experimentations, methods, and so on, I feel like we're not, funnily, we're not being scientific in our support of this putatively scientific principle. Okay, that was a lot. I'll stop there and pass it back to Emerson and Ben. Oh, I forgot to say at the start, A, great to be here, Emerson. Love the podcast. Really love everything you do. B, really love the 4th of July framing, Ben. I'm sorry I didn't wear a Union Jack t-shirt. If you'd only let me know in advance, I'd have been happy to do that.
Oh man, now I don't know who to root for. No, well, thank you for that, Dr. Weir. I love weaving in the history of philosophy there. So I'm going to hand it back to Ben just for a few minutes if you have any immediate thoughts you'd like to share, and then back to Ralph, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
How much time did we say we were going to do for these rebuttals, about roughly, to just...
You can take as much time as you want. How much were you thinking?
5-6 minutes, I think.
Yeah,
probably.
That's fine.
Would that be enough for you as well, Ralph? Okay. So let me first start off with common ground. So I mentioned in my opening statement that I had read Ralph Weir's book, The Mind-Body Problem and Metaphysics, and I can't recommend it enough. I think it's a very great book, and to my surprise, parts of the book that I found most influential in my own thought, Ralph admitted elsewhere that he was like, "Ah, it was kind of the most dry part of my book," and I was like, no, it was really, really good. And so for those who have followed my journey in the philosophy of mind will know that until a few years ago, I was, a card-carrying anti-reductionist, in that I was, pretty much firmly in the neutral monist, property dualist, non-reductive physicalist camp. And I have since been converted to the dark side of the reductionist camp. And one of, believe it or not, one of the leading motivations for that came from Ralph Weir in his book, but also thinkers like Ye-Guan Kim and Frank Jackson. And it's really what I came down to is that there's really only three choices for solving the mind-body problem that are really logically distinct, and those are materialism, idealism, and substance dualism. And that the non-reductive physicalist program, which is probably arguably the um, standard consensus view in philosophy of mind, is something of a promissory note that can't be cashed. And so I want to say right at the start that I think that I agree with Ralph, that if I or anyone is going to raise the interaction problem, that problem extends to the non-reductive physicalist program. Any kind of dualism, whether it be substance dualism or property dualism, you're going to end up with the same problem of trying to make sense of mental causation. And so you've got um, uh, reduction on the one hand, and you've got epiphenomenalism or parallelism on the other. And I think the philosophers have rightly wanted to resist both of those conclusions. I believe Ralph also conceded, one of the three ways of avoiding the kind of causal argument that I've said is to embrace epiphenomenalism. Frank Jackson famously did that for a little while with his, after the success of his Mary argument. But I think it can be shown, and I would agree with Ralph as well, by James's evolutionary argument against epiphenomenalism, that there are really powerful reasons to not go the epiphenomenalist route. But I also think the anti-reductionist arguments on the other side of this don't get the credit that they deserve. So I think they're all basically a variation of Descartes' conceivability argument in one way or another. Basically, they're trying to undo the necessary connection between mental and physical. And I think they're powerful, Chalmers' philosophical zombies, the Mary, not the knowledge argument, Nagel, and his inscrutable bats, Kripke, and his modal arguments, qualia inversions. I think these are all powerful reasons to at least look more into the reductionist camp. I had mentioned earlier Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, so I didn't do that so much to endorse her particular causal argument or her skepticisms. Is more what I wanted to do was draw attention that the criticism of the interaction problem is analogous to the problem of evil, in the sense that the critic is coming into the system like Elizabeth came into Descartes' system and was like, hey, giving all of these commitments, it's hard to work out how causal interaction is taking place here. And I think that's similar now, even though causation nowadays certainly wouldn't go by way, we wouldn't say that causation is contact on surfaces the way Descartes and Elizabeth would, but they would still, the tension is still there. The interaction problem. I want to respond to the common objection that this interaction problem just kind of comes from nowhere. I don't think it just comes from nowhere, just like I don't think that the problem of evil just kind of comes from nowhere. I think there are powerful intuitions that arise from tensions made by claims within the dualist program. I would also agree with Rao, his characterization of the causal argument. I think was spot on. So what puts me in this reductionist camp is the power of the causal argument, and then trying to get out from with my anti-reductionist sympathies that I once had. Once I kind of got under this causal argument, there's what's called the problem of causal exclusion, irreducibility, a supervenience thesis, causal closure, and causal exclusion entail epiphenomenalism. And so I was like, well, geez, if I want to avoid epiphenomenalism, how do I get out from underneath this? And so I think he's also right that the overdetermination option is not, the prospects there are dim. And so that of the three ways to try to get out from underneath this, the causal closure seems to be the route to go. But I myself, like Frank Jackson, we can go that route, but at the end of the day, I'm always left feeling rather unsatisfied because it does seem like the causal closure of the physical is something that is strongly supported. And so I want to, with whatever remaining time I've got left, I want to kind of get into why I think that is before I kind of rehash the very last argument that I gave on the translatability challenge, in which we can press the worry without causal closure. So I think that Ralph is right. There is this broad inductive support for the causal closure from the physical, specifically an enumerative induction. And so that argument also comes from non-mental datums. So we're inferring facts about the mental domain from observations about non-mental domains. So it would go something like all known non-mental events like chemical, biological, cell biological, histological, physiological, geological, meteorological, astronomical, all these different non-mental domains. The effects within them have sufficient physical causes. And so that we can then inductively infer that probably the mental domain is no different than these other ones. But I also agree with him that this could be very easily overturned. So we could have, if we were to find evidence in the mental domain contrary to this, that would just undercut that inductive support. It would be like, when we infer, all swans were white from all of our observations that swans were white, but then we discovered Australia and we found, swans that were not white. And so that just undercut that inductive support. And so the other way we can move directly from physics to neurobiology. So it's conceded on by all sides, I think, that the mental is neurobiologically realized. Mental events are happening in people's brains. And if neurobiology is physically realized, then the mental is also physically realized, because the realization relation is transitive. And so I think that's another reason to, at least at the level of brains, even if we're not inferring to causal closure throughout the whole universe, but at the level of brain states in everyday life, it seems that every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause. And I mentioned also in my opening, how am I doing for time? I think I've gone well more than 6 minutes.
Yeah, why don't you try to wrap it up in about a minute, and then we'll hand it over to Ralph.
Yeah, so in my opening, I mentioned the correlation thesis, the idea that it seems that there are physical states that are nomologically necessary for all known types of mental states. And so I think that that's an observation that is much more likely given causal closure than the negation of causal closure. And I also think that the negation of causal closure is not much more probable intrinsically than causal closure. And so from Bayes' theorem, it follows that, other things being equal, the negation of the causal closure is probably false. So I think that's at least a prima facie epistemic reason to accept causal closure. And to really quickly rehash let's say that causal closure is false. Does that help dualism meet the translatability challenge? I don't think it does. And that's where I brought in my example of the neural substrate of thirst and the neural substrate of a desire to drink water. And so if neuroscience were to discover the causal chain from those neural substrates, we would have to then translate that into interactionist terms. And could interactionist dualism do that? And I don't think that it can do that in practice. And so that's the de facto objection against interactionism. And so I'll go ahead and turn things over to Ralph.
We do have one comment that needs some attention here. It's going to get really interesting when Ralph hits his second bottle of fine red wine. Oh, you're muted.
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
I have an occasional bit on Twitter where I tell people what cheap claret they should be drinking, and I just want to make sure everyone knows this is Marks and Spencer's Claret Bordeaux. It's 2023. It's now £9 instead of £7.50. I think it was for. I think that's because of my advertising. So if Marks and Spencer would like to send me a case, that would be fine. It's really good stuff. But I haven't had the whole bottle. My fiance is in the other room, so we're sharing this one. Nonetheless, I will definitely open another if it gets to the bottom.
This episode is brought to you by that. I already forgot the brand of the wine, but yeah, this is a paid promotion, just so everyone knows.
Okay, good.
Now
that's
too early where I'm at. It's too early where I'm at to crack open
the
a
time
bottle of wine.
difference.
So I'm still on coffee out of my Moby Dick mug.
Now let me try to address these comments in something approaching reverse order, although I haven't written them down in the order they came in, so this might be slightly tricky. Just the last one on were neuroscience to discover that the physical cause of such and such effect of a mental state is this, and be able to show that this is the case with something like predictive certainty. Yeah, I think that would actually, to my mind, be neutral on dualism, because the dualist hypothesis would presumably be that there is some mental state that mediates between the two with predictive certainty. So I feel like the dualist theory, respecting the physical occurrences, would be empirically equivalent. So you, to that extent, have an underdetermination of theory by evidence. And then I would emphasize, but the dualist theory clearly predicts the existence of consciousness, whereas the physicalist theory plausibly does not. And so I'd say the dualist theory wins out. I think that would be different if the first cause had been understood at the level of fundamental physics. So we could see it's only those normal physical forces that need to be in operation to get the relevant effect. Because then it would be weird to suppose that in the nervous system of an animate being, you need this extra mental intermediate cause, given that all of these particles and fields or whatever are just doing what they already do in inanimate matter. I don't actually think the game stops there, because I think there are dualist versions of panpsychism as well as monist versions which can handle that. However, I then add, I don't think neuroscience has discovered that. And I'm personally, I think some of my allies in the dualist camp are understandably motivated to try to formulate a theory that can't be falsified by future evidence. So they think well, I don't want to adopt this theory because what if neuroscience made such and such observations? That might refute it. So I'm a hostage to fortune. But of course, we all agree that that's profoundly unscientific. Dualists should be formulating theories that might be refuted. So I insofar as this is something neuroscience might discover that might pose a threat, I think that's a good thing. It makes one's theory to some degree testable. I suspect ultimately the theory of mind is going to be not empirically decidable. There will be empirically equivalent theories, and it's going to be a matter of philosophy. Well, yeah, but nonetheless, if a theory can make predictions that allow it to be refuted, that's a good thing. Now, regarding correlations, I guess a related point I make is, Ben makes this interesting argument. This is not the causal closure argument. So if it works, I would say Ben gets the credit for proving physicalism, not David Lewis, David Papineau, the people working in the 50s and 60s. Just the Bayesian.
I'll take that.
Exactly. The correlations between mental states and physical states are more probable on the assumption of the causal closure principle, and one might say just more probable on the assumption of physicalism than they are on the assumption of dualism. So the fact that we find these correlations is evidence for physicalism over dualism. I think that's a really interesting argument. It's, I guess, new to me, at least in that kind of formulation. However, my first thought about how a dualist might reply is that they might say, well, to the degree that we are causal determinists, dualism is going to predict the same amount of correlation as physicalism. You would predict where you have the same physical events, you'll get the same mental effects, same mental events, same physical effects, and so on. At least I think that's going to be true for some versions of dualism. So that I'd say there'll be some versions of dualism which are not less likely on the basis of that observation. And the same would be more or less true for someone who's more or less a determinist, but not quite, because they think there are some exceptions. Then I would also say, like, I'm not really sure if the we've observed a lot of non-correlations as well, cases where we think maybe there's a correlation out there, but we're still seeking it. And at present, the same mental state can have coincide with different, what seem to us different physical states, and vice versa. So maybe the jury is out on this, or we need to reflect really carefully on what exactly the empirical evidence supports. I think this would really merit further investigation. Now, okay, there were a couple of other things I might want to add. At least 3 more things. Yeah. So I concluded by saying, like, regarding the causal closure argument, I think you have 2 options. You can defend the inductive case, but I think that's difficult because inductive evidence is easily defeated by further information. And so if you concede that, you concede it really turns on whether the arguments for dualism are persuasive, the conceivability arguments, Mary arguments, and so forth. And obviously everyone agrees if the arguments are unpersuasive, then by Occam's razor, we might as well be physicalists. If it depends on whether those arguments are persuasive, and we're conceding that if they are, causal closure doesn't matter so much, then the causal closure argument seems to have been defanged. And it sounded to me like Ben was inclined to concede that is correct. Maybe you'd want to say, like, something some people want to say is like, but the new information has to come from third-person empirical observation of the kind done in science. We would have to observe an effect in the nervous system that cannot be plausibly explained in terms of prior physical causation. And, well, I think, by the way, that's actually probably the way Sean Carroll's thinking about this. I infer this from some things he says. I think if one argues like that, one is essentially, again, not really relying on the causal closure argument, but on a methodological principle about what counts as evidence in favor of a theory, and it will ultimately come down to a dismissal of the kind of arguments put forward by dualists, which I know Ben finds sympathetic. So I think that probably one shouldn't take that view. One should concede that if there were a good argument for dualism, the inductive evidence of causal closure isn't going to cause a problem. Then regarding the direct evidence, I guess you didn't address this in detail, Ben, because you were running out of time a bit, but you did say it's conceded by everyone on all sides that the mental is neurophysiologically realized. So if the neurophysiological is physically realized, then the mental is physically realized. I would say no, I don't think it's conceded by all sides that the mental is neurophysiologically realized. It's conceded that it is, well, I think everyone within the family of like plausible theories given the current state of the discipline, as opposed to more radical speculation, it's conceded that the mental is intimately dependent on neurophysiology, including, I want to say, for like some of its cognitive architecture, but that's different from realization, right? One thing might be dependent on another without being at all metaphysically realized by it or reducible to it or nothing over and above it. So I still think, like, if we're not going to accept the inductive case for the reasons I've gestured at, we need direct empirical evidence, and I think this can't come from like some general concession that the mental is neurophysiologically realized. It needs to come from some experimental studies showing that the physical effects of mental causes are exactly what we would expect on the basis of only physical forces operating in the nervous system in the same way they do in inanimate matter. And I just think like that's not even in the horizon of the kind of thing empirical science is doing. Oh, one last thing, if I may. I actually think there's a kind of non-reductive physicalism that is immune to the causal closure argument. Property dualism of the Chalmers kind isn't, in my opinion, but I reckon there are other kinds that are. So maybe I would encourage you to reconsider maybe non-reductive physicalism of a certain kind that is that allows that the mental is ontologically nothing over and above the physical, but not reducible in the terms defined by Ernst Nagel's scientific reduction. I reckon it might have potential, at least regarding the interaction problem. Okay, that's enough.
One of the things I've discussed this with Emerson in private chat before too is kind of where I'm holding out in my anti-reductionist sympathies is with the reductive forms of panpsychism. The idea that, you know, there's the third person descriptions given to us by science, and then there's these intrinsic qualitative properties that are, you know, I find those views absolutely exciting, interesting. Like I guess there's a part of me that's just itching to find the next revolution in philosophy, and I think if it's going to be somewhere, it's going to be there. And so I'm kind of hoping that that's those forms of psychism. I'm not quite in that camp, but I've, you know, ask me in a couple months and I might be like, yeah, I was a panpsychist the whole time. I don't, you know, those were just my previous crazy reductionist thoughts. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting area of hopeful prospects coming in. And if there are, if someone can cash the non-reductive physicalist promissory note, I would love to see that. That's
Yeah, I guess it should just be stated for the audience that interactionist substance dualism is like the target of this argument, you know, the interaction problem. You know, it's not like this is a proxy for physicalism versus non-physicalism, because like you say, Russellian panpsychism doesn't violate causal closure. And there are also forms of substance dualism that don't, like parallelism or, you know, we kind of tabled overdetermination, but it's like a specific form of substance dualism that's, you know, under fire today.
at the end of the day, the thing I'm trying to protect is mental causation. So I think that without mental causation, you lose agency and cognition. So you lose action, you lose belief, you lose qualitative experience. And to me, you know, I'm trying to think of who it was. I think it was Fodor who says, you know, like if that view is true, it's the end of the world. And I'm kind of inclined to agree with him. Like if you take, you know, if you take away, you know, the qualitative aspects of our lives, you take away knowledge and you take away agency. Well, you pretty much take away everything that, you know, like if you were to ask, you know, well, what does it mean to be human? Well, you've pretty well lost everything that matters. If we were to go that route. Um, did we want to keep doing this kind of back and forth for 5 minutes
Yeah,
or so?
or
Did
we
we
can
want to
move
do open
on.
discussion?
We've accumulated some questions, but if either of you have something that you're dying to ask the other, we could do. Oh, actually, one thing I did want to ask Dr. Weir. Someone was wondering about David Papineau's paper that you were referencing. Like,
Yeah.
What is the source of that paper, and also what are his sources, if you have that on hand?
That's a great question, and one version of it is the first chapter of his book, Thinking About Consciousness. Let me find. I think there are 3 versions, and I think I have them written down.
Yeah, no, I think I have them too. I'm looking them up.
Okay, let's race. Who's quickest to draw?
The quickest to find it.
There's like a 2003 one, 2007, 2009. I mean, these will be easily found. One is called like The Completeness of Physics and Materialism. One's called like Causal Closure and the Mind-Body Problem or something like that.
Yeah, and of course, the internet on my computer is not working now for some reason. Here we go. Thinking about consciousness, it's one of the appendices in that. And
That's
then the other
right,
one is The
yeah.
Rise of Physicalism.
Yeah, yeah.
The Rise of Physicalism
That's
is
in an
the one
edited
that
collection,
goes
I
through, that gives
think.
the history of the philosophy of science and then how we. That sounds right. I think I have it as like a little standalone PDF, but I think you're right. I'd have to
Let's see
double
what
check
Phil
that.
Paper
Everything's
says.
moving. Yeah, it's Gillette. It's the Jeanette and Lower collection.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, and
these
as for
preprints come out,
his
don't give you
sources,
citation.
I mean, I think the point was kind of that they're few and far between. They're a little bit sparse, and they don't really show that causal closure has been demonstrated in the biological or physical realm.
Yeah, his sources for the physics are very good, and that's really the focus, because the causal closure argument's already popular, and he's showing like we should, if we're going to support it, we should think about it in these terms, not in terms of the physics. So for physics, the sources are good, but yeah, for the biology, I mean, at least when he actually comes down to the point of describing biological data, he doesn't cite any source. And I'm only inferring it's like Huxley and Hodgkin and all that stuff, just based on what was going on in neuroscience at the time. In fact, like the neuroscientists, the really influential ones of the 50s and 60s, who had a view on the topic, seem to me to have been sympathetic to dualism. It's people like Charles Sherrington, John Eccles, Wilder Penfield. Maybe the others were unsympathetic, but they don't seem to have talked about it in their publications, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to gang up on Ben here. I'm trying to be a neutral moderator, but I do think it's interesting that in the history of philosophy, you pointed to cases going back hundreds or even thousands of years. There's this tendency to overstate the case for causal closure, even when we would agree they did not have good evidence for it, like in the 17 or 1800s. So, you know, it's plausible that that's carrying over today. But I assume that those were somewhat a priori cases. So I wanted to ask Ben, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I wanted to ask Ben if you would think of your cases a priori or a posteriori or maybe both. Causal
It's
closure.
certainly not a priori. It's certainly not a priori. I confess that if you were to ask me what is the a priori justification for the causal closure of the physical, I wouldn't have. I just wouldn't have anything. I don't know. My Humean epistemology, so to speak, would just not allow me to go that route. I think it's definitely something that is, we have to go out in the world, and it is our explanatory theorizing about the world um, that moves us in the direction of a causal closure of the physical. And also, so I'm an engineer. My background is in mathematics and physics specifically. And so, like, if you were to open up physics textbooks, so, you know, the second law of thermodynamics is written down in the physics textbooks, but you're not going to find the principle of physical causal closure. That's very much a philosophical principle. It's something that's, you know, a metaphysical principle. Now, it can have support from the sciences, which I think it does, and from experience. But it's very much a something that has to be argued for. And I would be hesitant to um, hold it as something sacrosanct, as Ralph, you know, kind of already warned, because at the end of the day, it is provisional. It's a provisional principle that has inductive support, and that inductive support could be overturned with future observations and experiments. And so, I think if we're being responsible about our explanatory theorizing, we have to be open. And so that's why I framed a lot of my argument is in terms of the falsifiability challenge and the translatability challenge. Because what I want from the anti-reductionist theory is to make the empirical claims state, what they are, and then translate the empirical successes that we've had from our, current, physicalist paradigm into this new vocabulary that introduces non-physical causes. That's what I think a successful theory would look like. That's what I would want to replace the framework that I'm currently in with. And I'm I'm not as hopeful as I was a couple years ago, that will happen, but there's still a part of me that also really, I'm something of a mystery mongerer. The thing that makes the mind body problem so sublime is that it seems so intractable, and so there's a part of me that really doesn't want a solution to this problem, because if I had a solution, then I wouldn't have this sublime puzzle to think about. So there's a part of me that holds out and is very excited for future developments that might overturn this.
Yeah, if I may, I had a couple of thoughts about that and a question for Ben. I think something I meant to say earlier is I agree. There are some, like when you say the problem doesn't come out of nowhere, there really are intuitions. Like people aren't just pretending to think there's a problem here. I think that's obviously true. And I want to say, at least I can kind of see how there are some distinct problems which I really do intuitively sympathize with, that might be driving people's sympathy for the causal closure argument, because it feels like one way of articulating some concerns. And these problems relate to what you were just saying there. So it seems to me there really is a perplexing question about, suppose we think there are immaterial mental states, events, qualia, souls, whatever. How do we integrate that fact with our detailed neurophysiology, chemistry, physics, and so on? And in particular, when do these immaterial things start appearing in the gestation of an individual organism? When do they appear in the evolutionary history of species? I think there is an inelegance, at least about a view of the world that takes our contemporary naturalist kind of materialist picture and just adds in immaterial minds. It looks weirdly implausible. I don't think that's got to do with causal closure, really, but I do resonate with the concern that I would want to say we've moved to a picture that's more satisfactory in terms of its explanatory strength, because it's accommodating more of what we know to exist. It's accommodating subjective phenomenology, free agency perhaps as well, intentionality perhaps as well, and so on. So it's an improvement in that respect, but it's a big loss in the elegance of our picture. And it seems to me that because there's the battle going on about whether we should just be materialists of some pretty hard-nosed kind or not, all the attention, all the effort is poured into that. And even people who would like to kind of create the new view, work out, okay, what's the sophisticated view that integrates the idea of something beyond the physicalist ontology going to look like? I don't know. Again, I also don't know if that's really possible, but I certainly agree it would be worth trying, and might help make the non-materialist view seem more satisfactory. I guess I'd add, you can always have a more elegant theory if you dismiss some difficult phenomena. So I don't want to say this is really good evidence that physicalism is on the right track, that it's more elegant, but nonetheless, it's certainly true that the non-physicalist theories, the proponents are mainly concerned with defending the sheer plausibility of their view, and so there isn't nearly enough work on the details. Oh, and I had a question for Ben. The question, sorry, was, would you only count as evidence against the inductive case for causal closure? Would you only count as evidence against it third-person observation of publicly observable, physical effects in the nervous system or whatever that can't be explained by prior physical causes? Or would you accept a really good version of a logical argument for the existence of immaterial phenomenal properties, minds, or whatever?
Certainly the latter. So I want to be open to, kind of the belief of following argument wherever it leads. And I'm not of the school, my view, I wouldn't say is overly scientific. I think, a lot more weight to deductive logical arguments on the other side of this than I think a lot of
Sure.
other people in my own camp would. Just because I I I I guess it's a bias of my inner rationalist just won't let me go that far empiricist. Um, I kind of want a balance of both of them, and I'm interested to see what can come of this. I'm trying to remember who it was. It was an interview on Mind Chat, and I think it was Barry Lower, and he had this kind of offhand remark about the anti-physicalist arguments and was like, in polite company, I don't know what we can say, but these arguments are just crap. And I remember thinking like what? What, like why would he sit, like, I just found that such a strange, odd thing for a philosopher of his caliber um to be saying in a conversation. Goff was there, Keith Frankish was there, and they were having this conversation, and I just remember thinking, I don't know why, I don't know what principle allows us to give so much weight to these arguments of the former that you were talking about, the more inductive empiricist type arguments, while excluding those latter deductive logical arguments. I don't know where this comes from. I suspect that's the scientific streak that's all too common um, in contemporary philosophy. But I don't find, though I'm reluctantly in this reductionist camp now with people like Jaegwon Kim and Frank Jackson. I certainly don't sympathize with that former view that you described.
Sure. Maybe Lower meant they were crack in the sense of like a crack team of professionals. These are really good arguments.
I don't know. The
That sounds
remark
like
just
not.
sticks out in my head because I remember listening. Yeah, I remember listening to him and just being struck by how confidently, um, he said that, and so unprincipally said that. He just, not like he gave some sort of argument or backed it up or in any way tried to resolve the differences that because I think he was saying it in response to something Goff was saying in an anti-reductionist vein. It was basically just dismissing Goff's arguments as crap. And I remember, like, where's this coming from? I don't understand. I don't get it.
I guess that makes that the first time in history a physicalist was wildly overconfident about their position. They made
Yeah.
history that day.
I
I do have a super chat if you guys don't mind. This one is directed at Ben.
don't.
Ben, this is from John Buck. How do two distinct physical objects interact? So I think he's getting at that causation is mysterious in general, even strictly in the physical realm.
Yeah, so I would say they're located in space and they transfer energy. So I would give some sort of basic understanding. So causation isn't actually found in the equations of physics. So causation is kind of, there's several different views of causation. But the idea is that objects transfer energy in accordance with certain physical laws. And that yes, there's something mysterious about causation in general, but what we can do, and this brings us back to the pairing problem, is that by locating these objects in space, we can pair um, physical causes with physical effects. We can say this physical object is the cause and this physical object is an effect, rather than this other effect because of their locations in space. And so that spatial contiguity is what helps us make these pairings. And so my view of causation is non-committal. I kind of take a Humean view of this, and that I just try to understand causation in very minimal um, concepts of temporal priority, spatial contiguity, and constant conjunction. Do I think that's all there is to causation? No. Do I think I know what is over and above those requirements for causation? No. Um, but when I take those very minimal requirements of spatial contiguity, temporal priority, and constant conjunction, and I apply them to a dualistic model, and I say that minds are not located in space-time, well, then I don't know how to make sense of temporal priority, spatial contiguity, or constant conjunction. And so I think that's just an advantage that the physicalist framework has. It has a metaphysical framework in which it can locate its causal denizens.
What do you think about that, Ralph?
I would say two things. One is that I guess I don't think the dualist, if we're talking about dualism in the sense that contrasts with physicalism, has to be committed to minds being not located in space-time. In fact, of course, all dualists think, or I guess all think non-physical minds are located in time. I think that it's perfectly open to them to think that they're located in space, in the sense that there's always a fact of the matter about where they are, causally efficacious in space, something like that. They might not take up space in the sense that a solid object does, but then neither do many physical things, as usually represented in fundamental physics, so that doesn't seem like a problem. They still would qualify as non-physical if they're not described by physics, and or if they're fundamentally mental in nature. So I'm not sure if I'd see that as an advantage for physicalism. But on the side of the physicalist, I would say it does seem to me true that on a Humean view of causation does pose a problem to the Princess Elizabeth, Pierre Gassendi, how does it happen that a non-physical thing affects a physical thing kind of argument. It's not by impact, so what? There's no real mystery on human, well, there's no extra mystery on a Humean view because it's all mystery. But it doesn't help out the dualist in the case of the causal closure argument, at least if we agree that like the best elaboration of the Humean view of causation is going to be something like David Lewis's best systems analysis of causation and counterfactual analysis of causation and best systems analysis of counterfactuals, because on the Lewisian view, we should still only recognize those causal laws that belong to the system that best balances explanatory power and elegance, roughly speaking. And if we do always observe physical effects of physical causes of the same kind before physical effects of the relevant kind, then supposing that something mental also causes those effects would decrease elegance while adding nothing to explanatory power. So I touched on this briefly. So I think the Humean objection to the interaction problem does not help the dualist in the case of the causal closure problem.
I wanted to ask your personal view, Ralph. I was curious. Do you think the soul is located in space?
That was going to be my question.
Do I think the soul is located in space? I mean, there are parts of this debate on which I'm committed and parts on which I'm open. It seems to me I don't, not in any straightforward sense do I want to say the soul's located in space. But I would want to say, it seems to me the soul has to be meaningfully representable as located in something we could represent in the way we represent space, roughly by like Cartesian coordinates, because of the pairing problem. I'm inclined to grant that, but I don't think there's any need for it to be the space of empirical science, of perceptual observation. It could be anything relevantly isomorphic. And I'm sympathetic to the borderline idealist view that the non-mental entities are noumenal and don't stand in any very, very close relationship to the so-called physical things described by physics, and that the space that is investigated by physics is actually itself largely or wholly mental in nature, mental in much of its nature, because it's largely reducible to the perceptual states of entities with sensory faculties like ours. And I think actually that's somewhere where like quite a lot of self-identifying physicalists are kind of sympathetic to that the space of the manifest image, which is also the space of scientific experimentation, isn't the space of deep reality.
I have
do you guys mind if we read? Oh no, go for it. I was just going to ask if you guys are okay with us reading some more super chats after this.
Oh yeah, I'm totally cool with that. My question will be quick. Because you mentioned earlier that you think all dualists think that mentality is located in time. And so with, the advent of general relativity and special relativity, we, at least in our models, say that space and time are two sides of the same coin. So if something is located in time, it's also located in space. If it's located in space, it's also located in time. So do you think that the temporal location of a soul commits us to not some isomorphic other metaphysical time, but space, as we, that souls are located in space the same way Mercury is located in space because they're located in time? Or do you think there's some necessarily we need to separate time and
That's
space?
such a good question. This is the thoughts that come to me immediately. I would want to say, yeah. I think the sense in which all dualists, as I think now incorrectly said, would say the soul is located in time. The sense in which most dualists would say that would be, I guess, the phenomenological time. Like, it's very hard not to admit that the soul is, or the immaterial mind, or whatever it is located in the time that is manifest in the very interiority of one's conscious life. And that might not entail existence in physical time of the kind that is involved in physical observations. But having said that, it seems to me that dualists are going to be under a lot of pressure to say that the soul is in some sense located both in physical time and in physical space, at least insofar as we can pinpoint in our mathematical descriptions of the phenomenology of physical experiments, observations, where the causal activity of the soul is going on, something like that. Like if I want to have a causal impact on Ben's soul, where do I need to be? Well, either I've got to be somewhere in that room, roughly in front of you, or I can be in front of this camera. So that's going to give the soul, the coordinates of the observer in physics. So I think there's some sense in which, like, trivially, any dualist is going to be committed to the view that if by location we mean this, it's located somewhere. Just one caveat on all dualists thinking the soul's located in time. Thinking about it, like, Plato was not entirely committed to that. There are some classical Indian philosophical schools. I would say the dualist versions of Vedanta probably lean towards the view that the soul isn't truly located in time. Maybe Yoga Samkhya, I'd have to check. So actually, I think there's like a long tradition of thinking the soul is only in some quite superficial sense located in time or space, and its ultimate reality is eternal and unchanging. I find that harder to integrate, harder even than more familiar kinds of dualism to integrate with like our naturalistic picture of the material world. But it's a like profoundly important intellectual tradition and super interesting in its own right.
Excellent. Okay, I have a lot of follow-up questions, but trying to stay on target here. This is from Richard, hopeful agnostic. Oh, I didn't know you were in Sweden. That's Swedish currency, right? I feel like Ralph would know. Okay, so for both, how far down does it is?
Yeah, Swedish krona, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's what. Okay, yeah. Well, hello from Sweden. I didn't know you were over there. How far down does consciousness go? This is for both of you.
Ben, go ahead. How far down?
I don't know. So it depends on what month of the year in which you ask me, and which I'm thinking about it at the time. So I'm open to, it is a higher order biological function of specific brains like digestion, mitosis, photosynthesis. But I'm also open to panpsychist views and, saying that, look, there's some sort of proto-consciousness all the way down at the levels of electrons. So yeah, I think those views are kind of weird, but reality's weird. So I guess the weirdness doesn't bother me quite like it seems to bother other thinkers on this.
I would say if by down we mean how far down in terms of the lower complexity of physical organisms and then non-organisms, I'm sympathetic to the idea that consciousness is present in anything with a mammalian cortex or something equivalent to it, like the avian pallium. I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea that maybe the midbrain in mammals is responsible for basic consciousness, in which case we can attribute it to insects as well on that basis. And I think like basically anyone should accept that. If we go beyond that, we're starting to base our views on some kind of metaphysical reasoning that's taking us towards panpsychism. I'm also sympathetic to that, but then we're getting into pretty speculative territory, and even a panpsychist isn't going to say like there is an individual conscious mind, anything like our own, associated with just any old physical complex. So they might have the same idea that like maybe the fundamental particles are conscious, or maybe there's a fundamental cosmic mind identifiable with the basic physical fields, and there are conscious minds associated with beings with mammalian cortexes and so on, but maybe not with I don't know, maybe not with some invertebrates. And I'm thinking about this a lot at the moment. But down here could mean something else. It could be like down in terms of fundamentality and reality. You could be a dualist but still think consciousness isn't really fundamental. What's fundamental is some unconscious, ultimate, ineffable reality, Brahman, God, or whatever. I want to say we actually know. I want to say we know on the basis of how semantics works that consciousness is as fundamental as it gets. I think we have good reason to think that consciousness, whatever reality its most fundamental is, it includes consciousness. I give some reason for that in my book, but I won't go into them right now.
This book right here. Oh, hang on. And of course, my camera's not cooperating. I really do.
It's the world's first invisible book. I had to really talk Routledge into that. I wanted it to look like an immaterial soul.
The production costs were astronomical. People wouldn't believe it.
I persuaded them that very few copies would be needed, so they were happy to do that.
Phil just sent no message. Thank you, Phil. Appreciate that. Okay, this is kind of a tough one. Ben, can you explain deeper why energy cannot be created or destroyed? I like the challenge.
I was going to ask that too.
Yeah, so no, I don't think I can explain. So that's just one of kind of the fundamental law. That's a second law of thermodynamics. It's just kind of bedrock law of nature. And so if you're to ask, like, why can it be neither created nor destroyed? I don't know. Just
First
can't.
law.
First, did I say second? I meant first law.
Yeah. You're in atheist apologist
It's the
mode. You
conservation.
assumed it would be second.
Yeah. It's
So there's a case,
the-
isn't there, for thinking this law. Go. Sorry, go ahead.
is the conservation of energy. It's just, that's just the law. And so, like, we can speculate as to why it's that way rather than some other way, but I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I've not thought too deep about that question myself. But I do know that if your physical theory creates or destroys energy, then it's probably not going to be a successful theory.
I was just going to add that I think you can trace antecedents to the principle of the conservation of energy or energy in motion, or for more precise symmetries in contemporary physics, back to the idea, the medieval scholastic dictum that nothing comes from nothing, and all the way back, I think, to like pre-Socratic arguments about the impossibility of change. I actually think there may be a plausible a priori proposition which the conservation of energy instantiates, even though the conservation of energy in closed physical systems goes into greater detail and is in itself a priori. So part of the reason I was interested in this question of whether it's a priori earlier is that I think there might be a priori metaphysical principles in the vicinity.
It's certainly an interesting question. I don't have the background to answer it.
Yeah, it seems like you might have to go to like an a priori place to explain why that couldn't happen. I'm not sure what. I mean, it could obviously be a consequence of physical theories, but I'm not sure what direct observation you could make that would really push it one way or the other.
Maybe once we know once we have a theory of everything, we unify quantum mechanics and relativity theory, we'll go, oh, it's derived, that law is derived from these more basic fundamental equations. Maybe, I don't know. I have no idea.
You could always hypothesize where there seemed to be an increase in energy that's unexplained. You could hypothesize a hidden seam of energy conserved in an unknown way. If you wanted to preserve a conservation of energy principle, it would be a different version of the principle. It seems, I think, and I think there's reasons one might think one should do that, because it doesn't make sense to describe something as being able to, the background conditions as being able to result in this energetic activity, unless in some sense the background conditions contain that energetic activity in potential. That's like what, I don't know, Aristotelians would say, and I think modern science might be a bit more Aristotelian than it's given credit for.
Yeah. Phil wanted to know why I think all mammals are conscious. Just intuition?
Yeah, I think that there's three reasons. One is we know we're conscious. The second is we know we're closely related to other mammals evolutionarily, or we think we know that. And then the third is that we know that we're... Oh, okay, 4 reasons. The third is that we know we have similar behavior to animals, to other mammals. They exhibit the behaviors that we exhibit when we're undergoing sentient processes. And then the fourth is that our neuroanatomy is similar to other mammals, and in particular, there are a whole bunch of experiments that seem to show that activity in the cerebral cortex of certain kinds is associated with sentience. The cerebral cortex is highly preserved, highly conserved across mammals, So probably other mammals, when they undergo those neuronal processes, are conscious. Not everyone thinks this. Some people think distinctively primate neuronal structures are needed for conscious experiences, and some people think much more widely present midbrain structures will do the trick. So I'm kind of following what I take to be the consensus in the discipline there. John Birch has this excellent book, The Edge of Sentience, all about the state of the art in this area, and I strongly recommend it as a really good overview of this kind of question.
Yeah, I mean, I personally very strongly lean on the idea that it's very difficult to explain the behavior of mammals without invoking consciousness. So it's kind of an inference to the best explanation that, like, if you're going to try, I mean, it's really obvious with human behavior, but I think it also carries over to like lower animals even, where it's just very hard to explain their behavior if there just is no, no presence of mentality of any kind. Yeah, it's just, they're too complicated. Their behavior is too complicated. They seem to know things. They like, there's a lot about their behavior that is best explained by the fact that they're having mental states like ours. And I think that's also the solution to the problem of other minds as well. Okay. For both, what do you consider to be the greatest challenge to your positions?
The hard problem of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
The inelegance of having an immaterial mind in anything that looks like our naturalistic conception of the material world.
Okay, so it's that kind of like theoretical concern about elegance. Because I don't personally weight elegance very high. It seems too subjective, like what counts as elegant or inelegant.
Well, I think a great example, Philip Goff often brings this one up, is like, you could have a theory that's as empirically adequate as whatever contemporary scientific philosophical theory of reality like is, and add one invisible angel on the edge of the universe that does nothing and affects nothing. And we all agree, presumably we all agree, that's a worse theory. There's no reason to accept that over the former. Our reasoning is that it's unjustifiably less simple. And I agree. Like, we want our theory to be as simple as reality is and no more. And reality clearly isn't all that simple. At least empirical reality doesn't seem to be. But nonetheless, that I only said that's the biggest challenge to my view. And since my view is obviously correct, it stands to reason that the biggest challenge would be quite small.
Fair point. Yeah. So we have a super chat for £1 million, which I think is about 700 million American dollars at this point. So question for both: will AI/AGI be conscious? So for Ralph, that would be like, do you think that computers could have souls? And for Ben, it's a slightly different question.
What do you think, Ben?
So I don't think there's anything in principle standing in the way of an AI being consciousness. Do I think current AI is conscious? No.
I think this is a genuinely open question, and there are theories on the table compatible with everything I think that go both ways. It seems to me that the main reason anyone's confident AI can't be conscious is that they're committing what I call the Leibniz's mill fallacy, where they think, well, if I shrunk myself down really small and walked around inside this deep neural network, all I'd see is a bunch of silicon circuits. I wouldn't find any consciousness. And we know it's just that. That's all there is there. So there can't be consciousness. But of course, we know that's true of a human nervous system or any mammalian nervous system. And yet there is consciousness in those cases. So it seems to me that there's not a really good argument for being skeptical of AI sentience at some point on the basis of uncontroversial premises. And I think this is genuinely worrying.
Yeah, there are a lot of ethical issues that come up as soon as you think they might be conscious, at least, at some point in the future. But I do accept, I think it's called substrate independence. I don't see why it would have to be something like carbon based, in order for like a soul to causally interact. I don't understand why souls couldn't become causally connected, like come to be in a reliable set of causal connections with something that's made of metal and silicon. Like I don't see why dualists would be opposed to that. I don't see why materialists would be opposed to, just, I mean, especially if you're some kind of functionalist, it seems like you should definitely
Yeah,
be
if you're a
open.
functionalist, you have to, you're a functionalist because of multiple realizability. And so why not think that AI is one of those multiple realizable things?
Yeah.
I think that might depend slightly on what kind of functionalist you are. Of a traditional sort of functionalist, it's all about overall inputs and outputs and internal states that can be mapped onto like a Turing machine. There, yeah, I think you're forced to accept the possibility of AI sentience. But you might be a functionalist in the sense that you think that at some level of detail, functional isomorphism with a conscious organism will be sufficient for consciousness. But that could be way lower than the level of isomorphism that any AI or AGI we create will exhibit. It could involve, like, I don't know, the like molecular structure, whereas the AGI is only functionally isomorphic with the neural circuitry. So I think there's a little bit of room for functionalists, but basically I agree. Functionalism pushes you in this direction.
Yeah. I've got a question here that was directed at Ben, but I would actually like Ralph to answer it because you were granting part of the inductive case for causal closure. So the question from Phil is, why would observations regarding non-mental events contribute to an inductive case regarding mental events?
So I guess that I'd want to answer the question with another question, like, so why wouldn't it? So, if I'm considering non-mental events like chemical events, meteorological events, astronomical events, physiological events, geological events, and they all have sufficient causes, all the, physical effects in them have sufficient physical causes, why would I think that the mental domain was any different from those non-mental domains? What would be the principal difference between the mental domain and the non-mental that wouldn't allow me to carry that inductive generalization over? And so, inductive generalizations have to start from somewhere, and we don't want them to be question begging. So the inductive generalization would obviously start from non-mental events and then make an inductive inference to mental events. That's just how inductive generalizations work. So I don't know how else we would validly make an inductive generalization here.
Yeah, I'd say this speaks to some like really interesting deep issues about when induction is legitimate, and there are good rational grounds for thinking that it's never legitimate, and yet we all kind of know it is. So I would want to suggest that one answer would be like, well, insofar as induction's reasonable, you can do it so long as there's some relevant similarity between the case to which you're drawing the induction and the case from which you're drawing it. So I don't know, suppose you've got like billiard balls of different colors in front of you, and you find that red, blue, orange, and yellow all fall to the floor when you drop them. You've never seen gravity before. There's a green one there too. I would want to say, well, what you might say, why should observations of what happens with billiard balls of other colors contribute to an inductive case about the green billiard ball? But I think we'd all say probably it does, because it's still relevantly similar, or it's still similar in some respects. However, I say if something's really, really different and only similar in very few respects, in the way that you might say like mental events are really different from all other physical events. If you're, at all inclined to the case of dualism, you think this is something profoundly distinctive in the world, you might think, this is like having a load of billiard balls and a helium balloon or something in front of you, and thinking you can infer from the fact that these fall to the floor that this is going to fall to the floor. Maybe actually someone sympathetic to dualist arguments ought to expect that things would be radically different in the case of minds, and therefore, you might think like me and Ben, as people like with not entirely settled views on this, but both sympathetic to the dualist arguments to some degree, are actually both begging the question by saying there's an inductive case based on observations not involving mental events.
This is kind of a loaded question in the same vein. Does Ben accept causal closure has not been demonstrated?
No. So I guess it also depends.
Can I answer that question?
By demonstrating.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. So I guess also it's somewhat of a loaded question just because of the word demonstrated and the ambiguity of how that can be used. So do I think that there's like a deductive argument from, certain premises to causal closure? No, it's not been demonstrated in the sense that like a mathematical theorem would have been demonstrated. But do I think that there's inductive support from both neuroscience and physics along the lines that David Papineau would argue? Yeah, I think there are good reasons for accepting causal closure, and I like to think that I laid out some of those reasons. Do I think that those reasons are provisional? Yes. Do I think that they're a sacrosanct principle that's not can't be overturned with future evidence? No. I think there's the reasons that I gave today are certainly defeasible, and there's certain like with any plausible theory, there are certain ways out. We can avoid the causal argument that I put on the table by going an overdetermination route, an epiphenomenalist route, or challenging the causal closure route. And I think all three of those routes are valid routes to try to avoid the causal argument I've put on the table. At the end of the day, am I satisfied with any of those outs? No. That's why I find myself in the camp I'm in today. I find overdetermination hard to believe. I find epiphenomenalism hard to believe. I find denying causal closure hard to believe. If something were to come along and convince me otherwise, then I would take that route, because at the end of the I started in the anti-reductionist camp, and I've worked my way into a corner out of that camp, and I'd kind of like to return to it.
Yeah, I mean, you were making an inductive case, so like demonstrated is obviously too strong. But I was wondering what you thought about Ralph's claim that the evidence from physics commits the streetlight fallacy, because interactionism doesn't predict that we'd see effects in particle colliders. So maybe even if that is technically some inductive evidence, it just shouldn't really push you towards causal closure. So what do you think about the streetlight fallacy?
So I think it's an interesting analogy. It's definitely something that we should, have something to respond to. But I also think that I worry that it's kind of an insulation strategy as well. Analogous to that's why I framed this in terms of a falsifiability challenge to, because I wanted to draw an analogy with something like an invisible dragon in the garage, in the sense that in all the ways in which we try to falsify it, we just kind of move close. We keep avoiding refutation by making all these ad hoc assumptions. And so that's my worry about it. And so to counteract that worry, so I don't just put the case from physics on the table. I think there's also that case from neurobiology as well. So arguing from the correlation thesis to at least a restricted causal closure thesis, one whose scope is limited to everyday life and the domain in which brain functioning takes place. And that if we assume some sort of causal closure of the neurobiological, confers a very high likelihood on a supervenous thesis, something that the correlation thesis would entail. Whereas, substance dualism says that these can come apart, that we can have mental states without physical states. And so this correlation thesis is not something entailed. And so then that gives some sort of prima facie reason to reject the negation of that restricted causal closure principle. And so I think that is in a way in which we've met the conditions of that analogy. We have gone and looked in that dark place. Um, and we've not found anything so far. Does that mean that we won't find the keys in the dark place sometime in the future? No, we might not have checked all the different places. Ralph will be very quick to point out that, our technology for searching, uh, neurophysiological states is just limited to the time and place that we're at. And as time moves forward, that technology will get better and we'll be able to do, better and better experiments that become much more fine grained and more accurate. And perhaps that's when we will discover those non-physical causes, those ways in which effective quantum field theory, its predictions are overturned by some repeatable observation. And that's the revolution I'm looking for. That would be the point in which, our physical theories would be forced to change. And I think that would be just wonderful.
Okay, jumping back in here. I'm
I'm
If
going to
I
have
could
to
just
head
jump
out
in and
here
say,
oh,
yeah,
yes.
I'm also going to have to go after maybe one last question, something like that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Maybe we can try to
yeah, I'm
go
going
through
to
these
have,
a little faster
yeah,
because there are a few questions
yeah,
about your views, Ralph. That would be
yeah, I'm going to have to head out
If we can
here.
go through
My
them
kids are
in a
waking up
sort
from a
of
nap.
okay. Let's get moving here. Because Emerson is a ginger and has no soul, is he still conscious? First of all, you're banned. That's very offensive. And more seriously for Ben, what about pea zombies? How do you deal with them? Ben is a ginger too. So, I mean, you're kind of coming into the lion's den here.
So I'll answer this one real quick, but then I am going to have to go because
Okay.
I'll have to go. I hear my kids have woken up from their nap. So I'm going to have to go tend that. So I'm in the camp. I'm what's called an analytic functionalist. Um, so I think that once we had all of the right concepts in which to think about mentality and how they fit into the physical world, we would then see that P zombies are not conceptually possible. And so because they're not conceptually possible, they're not metaphysically possible. That's a tough bullet to bite, I admit, because it certainly seems prima facie that, like, hey, I can conceive of um, the metaphysical possibility of someone who behaves exactly like me, but just doesn't have any conscious experiences. But I think that's because of problems with our concepts.
Okay. Does the seemingly perfect correlation between brain processes and consciousness imply either one causes the other, or is there something else more fundamental causing both?
I would deny
I
there's
don't
a
think I
seemingly
fully understand
perfect
the question.
correlation.
Yeah.
I would say there's not
Because
a
I am going
seemingly
to have to
perfect
go. I'm
correlation, but if
sorry. I
there
had
were,
to cut y'all short.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming, Ben. Thank you for participating.
Yes. Thank you for
He has
having
some
me on. I'm sorry
fatherly
to have
duties.
to.
really great to chat. Let's do it again and continue on another occasion. That'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. But yes, fatherly duties call.
All right, have a good one. Okay. Do you have
I'll have
another
to
like
run
5 minutes?
but yeah, I have literally 5 minutes I can manage. To this one, I would want to say we should take seriously the possibility of something more fundamental causing both. I think it's an insightful point and might give Ben a way out of having to be a reductive physicalist. Well, he sounds like he might be moving in exactly that direction.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna try to go through these fast because I think they're really interesting. Most of it's about some of this weirder evidence from parapsychology and kind of what you think about it. So yeah, someone's claiming that you don't rely on parapsychology to support your argument for dualism, but you're not opposed to it. And this other person is asking about near-death experiences being evidence for dualism.
Yeah, I want to base my arguments on stuff I'm really sure of. and I haven't had a near-death experience. I stuff that like has been verifiable by replicable physical experiments seems pretty good. In the case of parapsychology, you have this awkward position where these observations can be replicated, but only by people sympathetic with the theories, broadly speaking, right? And I could well believe that that's because there's a great fashion for being a kind of naturalist materialist. And in fact, the evidence from parapsychology is better than it's generally given credit for. I know people who take this evidence very seriously, who are super clever and intellectually scrupulous. So I'm not inclined to dismiss it, but I don't think one needs it in order to make the kind of case I'm making. And I guess my gut instincts are somewhat skeptical about anything we can't consistently replicate. There's a friend of mine, Sharon Hewitt Rawlett, or someone I know at least, is gonna, I hope, publish a book with Oxford University Press real soon. I can't remember what the title is. It's changed a couple of times in manuscript, but that will put forward a really exciting new theory of consciousness that does draw on some of this more fringe kind of or controversial kind of evidence, and at least in some respects. And I'd really recommend looking at that. I find it fascinating, but I don't think one needs to draw on it to say what I want to say.
What was their name again?
Sharon Hewitt Rawlett.
Okay, well, I know you're pressed for time, so we're going to end it there. Thank you so much. And thank you to Ben for participating as well. People are saying, let him go to his kids. No, you need to abandon your children and your family to pursue philosophy full time, what really matters. But thank you so much, Dr. Weir, for coming on again. And yeah, I hope we do it again sometime.
Absolutely, me too. Thanks so much for setting the event up. It was so great to do it. And thanks to everyone who's listened to.
All right, have a nice night. Okay, so that is where we're going to end it for tonight. Thank you to everybody who watched. Thanks to all of our super chatters and for all the people who asked questions and watched. I'm going to I saw one question directed at me. What is my definition of a soul? Well, it's just a mind. I mean, that's basically it. It's just an immaterial mind. Yeah, I mean, just however you think about consciousness, that's what dualists are going to define it as. It's an immaterial substance. Yeah. So sorry if that's not detailed enough, but that's the short version. Okay, so I think we are actually going to end it there. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, thanks to all the questions and especially to the super chatters. I will see you all later.